And welcome back. The Disability Rights Advocates is the leading national not-for-profit disability rights legal center with the mission of creating equal rights and opportunity for all people with all types of disabilities nationwide. Now, they recently filed a lawsuit against the New York City Department of Education for a Bronx middle school teacher. And here now to share with us more is a little bit of staff attorney at Disability Rights Advocates. We're pleased to be joined by Emily Seelenfreund. And thank you, Emily, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Darren, for having me on.
And so let's begin. As I shared with a little bit with our viewers, recently a lawsuit was filed on behalf of New York, I should say against the New York City Department of Education for a Bronx middle school teacher. Give us a little background into this.
Absolutely. So Dania Manderson is really an excellent teacher. She has been with the Department of Education for over 10 years. She teaches 8th grade English, but she's taught in other roles as well. She's been a school leader. She was in the principal's pool for promising educators. But despite all of that, every day at school was a challenge, and not just kind of the standard problems that middle school teachers deal with, but because she could not use the restroom at her school. Ms. Manderson uses a power wheelchair, and there was no restroom in her entire Bronx middle school that was accessible to her.
Wow. And so therefore a lawsuit. Talk to us about the case and where it is.
So we obviously first attempted to work with the DOE to settle the case, but we were unable to do so. So we brought a lawsuit, and there were other accessibility barriers that Ms. Manderson was facing as well. The fire safety room, which is her designated evacuation point in the event of an emergency, was basically filled with all kinds of storage, basically. And so there was no way for her to navigate her power wheelchair to the window. So it was a big safety hazard for her. And then she wanted to be able to grade her students' journals electronically because lugging home 90 journals was nearly impossible for her. But the DOE was unwilling to commit to that. So we filed this lawsuit, and I'm pleased to announce that we were able to settle the lawsuit and get relief for Ms. Manderson. So there will be a restroom that she can use in her Bronx Middle School. The DOE has committed to maintaining a path of travel through the fire safety room, and has committed to ensuring that her students can journal electronically on computers.
Excellent. And I use all that as a forum to just really as a launching pad to say about the work that you do, because you do work and great work in terms of advocating for those who have disabilities. When it comes to where we are in New York City and across the nation, how do you feel about the receptivity towards those with disabilities? Are we becoming more tolerant and more acceptable in the things that are being required?
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, people with disabilities are doing much better than we were 30 years ago. We have a very expansive civil rights law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which celebrated its 30th birthday last year. So congrats to the ADA. But what people don't know about the ADA is that private citizens need to go out and enforce it. It did not come with a regulatory board or an ADA police who are going to go around and say, there's a stair here. There's no pedestrian signal for a blind person to be able to cross here. And so it's the job of organizations like Disability Rights Advocates and like brave plaintiffs like Dania Manderson to go ahead and make that change for us. And so we're making progress, but I would note that a 2018 report noted that only 1 in 5 schools in the New York City Department of Education are fully accessible. That means 80% of schools have accessibility barriers. And that means folks like Ms. Manderson every day go to school and battle those barriers.
Yeah. And so when we talk about these barriers, I mean, what are some of the common barriers that we see that we may not be so familiar with?
Well, I can talk about something that most New Yorkers face on a daily basis, especially if they're commuting. They get outside and they hop on the subway. For many folks, that's easy. For folks with disabilities, that's significantly less easy. Only 25% of New York City subway stations have an elevator or an accessible path of travel to get to the train. This influences every part of being a New Yorker. It influences where you live. It influences if you can get drinks after work, etc. And DRA has filed 2 large class action lawsuits against the MTA seeking to change this. I myself use a wheelchair and really struggle to get around New York City.
Yeah. And we know that transit can be such a challenge, and particularly during the winter season. What has been the response of MTA and New York City transit system when it comes to dealing with these matters? Are we seeing an expansion of possibly elevators?
So we have been in litigation with the MTA for 4 years on this topic. We have heard them for the first time in a long time recognize that accessibility is a priority, and it's not just something nice to do, but something kind of legally required and that must be done. But what we're encouraging them to do now is commit to a long-term plan to provide full access for the system, because we all know priorities can change, right? There can be catastrophes, there can be pandemics, and future administrations might not be so committed. So we want them to commit now so that future administrations don't have a choice but to prioritize access.
Yeah, I know in doing some research about your work, you emphasize that people of color, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous people with disabilities, are especially impacted by disability rights violations. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, there is a huge correlation, first of all, between disability and poverty, and I think that's important to note. Many people with disabilities struggle to work, and that's not because they all can't work in many situations, but because we have not kind of gotten rid of the access barriers that make it difficult for them to work. And so that is really important, and DRA recognizes that confluence. And secondly, and I'm sorry that we have a visitor in the back.
That's all right.
The second thing I would note is that, like many civil rights movements, kind of the most privileged have come to the front, and that was often white folks with disabilities. And I think now our organization is recognizing that kind of we've prioritized the most privileged voices in the disability community, and that's often white folks with disabilities for far too long. And so and because of that, kind of their needs were attended to first, leaving behind the needs of BIPOC communities in many circumstances. And I think our organization now is making a concerted effort to do outreach to other groups to make sure that the disability rights movement is for everyone, because disability really can impact everyone. It does not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, gender, etc.
Yeah. So how have you been getting the message out?
I think be aware. If you're walking down the street and you're trying to cross the street and you realize there's no accessible pedestrian signal for a blind person to cross, tell a friend. Just talk about disability and do what you can to make your spaces accessible and get involved. Join a protest. We're often outside of subway stations trying to get the MTA to do the right thing. So yeah, hop on there and grab a sign and help us make the world more accessible.
Well, certainly want to thank you so much for joining us and the work that you've done on behalf of those with disabilities. And thank you for being with us, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me and for spotlighting this important issue.
All righty. Well, we'll let you know if you want more information. Please visit the website, dralegal.org, and follow them on social media at DRA Legal. Listen, we got more show. Don't go anywhere. Open continues coming up right after this.